Last Days of Socrates with Leo McKern. Part 1.
Tanton Sophotatos Socrates.
In the year 399 BC, Socrates, at the age of 70, was brought to trial on charges of impiety and of corrupting the minds of the young. He was found guilty and was condemned to death. Plato, his most devoted disciple, has presented in his early dialogues the essence of his teaching and the logical system of question and answer that Socrates perfected in order to define the nature of virtue and knowledge. In 4 of his works, Euthyphro, The Defense of Socrates, Crito, and Phaedo, Plato presents Socrates before, during, and after his trial. The last one of these is an account of Socrates' last hours in prison and ends with his drinking the hemlock.
Titophosios.
Euthyphro, Athens, 399 BC. Outside the courthouse where he is shortly to stand trial, Socrates meets Euthyphro, a religious expert.
Socrates, you here?
Euthyphro!
How come you've left your usual haunts? I don't suppose you've actually got a case for trial, as I have.
No, Euthyphro, it's not a private case, but a public action.
I can only assume that someone has brought an action against you, then.
Exactly.
And who is he?
I don't even know him very well myself, Euthyphro. He seems to be a young man of no particular distinction. I believe he's called Miletus.
Miletus?
Young, long, straight hair and a thinnish beard and a rather beaky nose.
I don't remember him, Socrates. But tell me, what sort of action has he brought against you?
What sort? Not a trivial one, as I see it. It's no small achievement to have made such an important discovery at his age. He claims to know how the characters of the young get corrupted and who the people are that are responsible. I expect that he's a clever fellow who has observed my ignorance and is coming forward to denounce me to the state for corrupting his contemporaries, like a little boy telling his mother. It seems to me that he's the only one of our politicians who is beginning in the right way. Because the right way is to give one's attention first to the highest good of the young. He will obviously become the author of countless incalculable benefits to the state. At any rate, that would be the natural result from such a beginning.
I should wish it to be so, Socrates, but I am very much afraid that the opposite will happen. It seems to me that in trying to injure you, he is simply beginning to ruin our city at its very heart. Tell me, what are the activities by which he asserts that you corrupt the young?
Absurd ones, my very good friend. At any rate, on the first hearing, he says that I am an inventor of gods. And it is precisely because I invent new gods and don't acknowledge the old ones that he has brought this action against me. So he says.
I see, Socrates. It's because of your saying that you are constantly visited by your supernatural voice. So he has indicted you for introducing unorthodox views. And he is coming into court to misrepresent this sort of thing to the masses.
That's right.
Why, you know, even in my own experience, when, in predicting the future, I make some statement about religion to them in the assembly, they laugh at me as if I were crazy. And yet I have never predicted a word that wasn't true. But it makes no difference. They are jealous of all of us who possess these qualities.
Oh.
Still, we mustn't let them worry us, but close with them boldly.
But, my dear Euthyphro, just being laughed at is presumably nothing to worry about. If they only intend to laugh at me, as you say they do at you, it wouldn't be at all unpleasant to spend our time in the law court joking and laughing. But if they're going to be serious, then there's no knowing how the case will turn out. Except for you prophets.
I dare say that it will come to nothing, Socrates, and you will conduct your case satisfactorily, as I expect to conduct mine.
Oh, yes, Euthyphro. What is this lawsuit of yours? Are you defending or prosecuting?
Prosecuting.
Whom?
Someone. By prosecuting whom, I'm increasing my reputation for craziness. My father.
My good man, your own father? What is the charge?
Manslaughter, Socrates.
Good heavens. Oh, of course, Euthyphro. Most people have no idea what the rights of such a case are.
I quite agree.
Is the person that your father has killed a member of your own household? Oh, obviously he is. You wouldn't, of course, be prosecuting him for killing an outsider.
It is funny that you should think that it makes any difference, Socrates. As a matter of fact, the deceased was a day laborer of mine. We were farming in Naxos, and he was working for us there. Well, he got drunk, lost his temper with one of our servants, and knifed him. So my father bound him hand and foot and threw him into a ditch, and then sent a man over here to ask the proper authority what was to be done. In the meanwhile, he not only troubled himself very little about the prisoner, but neglected him altogether, considering that he was a murderer, and it would not matter if he died. And that was just what happened. What with starvation and exposure and confinement, he died before the messenger came back from consulting the expert. That is why both my father and my other relations are angry with me, because on a murderer's behalf I am prosecuting my father for manslaughter, whereas in the first place, as they maintain, my father did not kill the man, and in the second, even supposing that he did kill him, since the dead man was a murderer, one needn't bother to defend such a person. At any rate, they say, it is an act of impiety for a son to prosecute his father for manslaughter. They have a poor comprehension, Socrates, of how the divine law stands with regard to piety and impiety.
But tell me, Euthyphro, do you really believe that you understand the ruling of the divine law so accurately? That in the circumstances you describe, you have no misgivings? Aren't you afraid that in taking your father into court, you may turn out to be committing an act of impiety yourself?
No, Socrates. I would be no better than the common run of men if I didn't have accurate knowledge about all that sort of thing.
In that case, Euthyphro, since you have this remarkable talent, the best thing I can do, I suppose, is to become your pupil. And before Meletus's case against me comes on, to challenge him upon this very point, saying that even in the past I was eager for knowledge about religion, and now, since he asserts that I'm grievously at fault in my independent thinking and in my unorthodox views about religion, I have become your pupil. And if he refuses to listen and doesn't drop the case against me, or indict you instead, I suppose I'd better repeat the same challenge in court. Is that right?
Upon my word, Socrates, if he really tried to indict me, I fancy I should find his weak spot, and we should have had our say about him in court long before he had his about me.
I realize that as well as you do, my dear friend. And that is why I appeal to you, to tell me what you mean by piety and impiety, both in respect of manslaughter and in all other connections. Isn't it true that in every action, piety is self-identical? And similarly, impiety, in every instance the opposite of piety, is yet also consistent with itself. In other words, that everything that is to be regarded as impious has a single definite characteristic in respect of its impiety.
No doubt that is quite true, Socrates.
Then tell me, how do you define piety and impiety?
Very well. I say that piety consists in just what I am doing now, prosecuting a wrongdoer for manslaughter or temple robbery or any other such crime, whether the offender happens to be your father or your mother or anybody else, and that not to prosecute such a person would constitute impiety.
No doubt. But surely you admit that there are many other actions that are either pious or impious.
So there are.
Well then, do you recollect that what I urged you to do was not to tell me about one or two of these many pious actions, but to describe the actual feature that makes all pious actions pious? Because you agreed, I believe, that impious actions are impious, And similarly, pious one's pious, in virtue of a single definite characteristic. Or don't you remember?
Yes, I do.
Then explain to me what this characteristic is, in itself, so that by fixing my eyes upon it and using it as a pattern, I may be able to describe any action, yours or anyone else's, as pious if it corresponds to the pattern, and impious if it doesn't. What makes actions pious, and what impious?
If that's how you want your answer, Socrates, that's how I will give it.
That is how I want it.
Very well, then. What is agreeable to the gods is pious, and what is disagreeable to them, impious.
An excellent answer, Euthyphro, and in just the form that I wanted. Whether it is true, I don't know yet. But no doubt you will go on to make it clear to me that your statement is correct.
Certainly.
Yet isn't it common knowledge, Euthyphro, that the gods themselves are divided and disagree with one another?
Very well. Then I should say that piety is what all the gods love, and that the opposite, what all the gods hate, is impiety.
So an act of piety is loved by all the gods just because it is pious, or for some other reason?
No, because it is pious.
So it is loved because it is pious, not pious because it is loved by the gods.
It seems so.
But it is because a thing is loved by the gods that it is an object of love, or God-beloved.
Of course.
Then what is God-beloved is not the same thing as what is pious, Euthyphro. Nor is what is pious the same as what is God-beloved, as you assert. They are two different things.
How do you make that out, Socrates?
Because we agreed that what is pious is loved because it is pious, and not pious because it is loved. Isn't that so?
Yes.
Well, isn't the truth rather that where there is piety, there is uprightness? But where there is uprightness, there is not always piety. Or do you think otherwise?
No, I think that you are right.
Then observe the next step. If piety is a form of moral uprightness, then presumably we ought to discover what kind of moral uprightness piety is. Don't you see that our discussion has gone right round and come back to the point from which we started, when we found that piety and what is God-beloved are not the same, but are two different things. Don't you remember?
Yes, I do.
Then we shall have to start our inquiry about piety all over again, because I shall never give up of my own accord until I have learnt the answer. Only don't refuse to take me seriously, but do your best now to give me your closest attention and tell me the truth, because you know it if any man does.
Yes, but Socrates...
If you didn't know all about piety and impiety, you would never have attempted to prosecute your aged father for manslaughter. You would have been too much afraid of the gods, and too much ashamed of what men might think, to run such a risk in case you should be wrong in doing so. So tell me your opinion, my most worthy Euthyphro, and don't conceal it.
Some other time, perhaps, Socrates.
Oh, but what a way to treat me, my friend. Fancy you going off like this.
But I have an urgent engagement somewhere.
I hope that if I'd learnt from you about piety and impiety, I could escape from Meletus's indictment by demonstrating to him that I had now become instructed by Euthyphro in religion.
I must be off.
And no longer, in my ignorance, express independent and unorthodox views. And also, I could live better for the rest of my life.
The defense of Socrates.
Socrates adice, tus teneus diapteron, kai Theus, us hepolis nomis Dei, unomis don, hetera de daimonia caina.
Inside the courthouse, a walled-in open space in which 501 representative citizens sit as the jury. 3 Athenian citizens, Meletus, Anytus and Lycon, have brought a public action against Socrates as being a danger to society. The charge of impiety, of heresy against the gods, was intended to inflame prejudice, although Socrates was punctilious in his religious observances. The second and more serious charge was that Socrates corrupted the minds of the young. The target here was political. Some of Socrates' friends and disciples were right-wing aristocrats abhorred by the ruling Democratic Party. The prosecution also counted upon Socrates' unpopularity with those whose self-pride he had offended. They hoped that his uncompromising attitude would alienate the jury, which normally expected flattery and abject entreaties. According to court procedure, litigants had to state their own case without the help of counsel. The prosecution spoke first, and when the defendant had replied, the jury, without any guidance or summing up from the presiding magistrate, at once gave its verdict by a majority vote.
Socrates is guilty of corrupting the minds of the young and of believing in deities of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state.
I do not know what effect my accusers have had upon you, my fellow Athenians, but for my own part I was almost carried away by them. Their arguments were so convincing. On the other hand, scarcely a word of what they said was true. I was especially astonished at one of their many misrepresentations. I mean that when they told you that you must be careful not to let me deceive you, the implication being that I am a skillful speaker, I thought that it was particularly brazen of them to tell you this without a blush, since they must know that they will soon be effectively confuted when it becomes obvious that I have not the slightest skill as a speaker. Unless, of course, by a skillful speaker, they mean one who speaks the truth. If that is what they mean, I would agree that I am an orator, though not after their pattern. My accusers, then, as I maintain, have said little or nothing that is true. But from me, you shall hear the whole truth. Not, I can assure you, in flowery language like theirs, decked out with fine words and phrases, no. What you will hear will be a straightforward speech in the first words that occur to me, confident as I am in the justice of my cause, and I do not want any of you to expect anything different. It would hardly be suitable for a man of my age to address you in the artificial language of a schoolboy orator. One thing, however, I do most earnestly beg and entreat of you. If you hear me defending myself in the same language which it has been my habit to use both in the open spaces of this city, where many of you have heard me, and elsewhere, do not be surprised. And do not interrupt. Let me remind you of my position. This is my first appearance in a court of law at the age of 70, and so I am a complete stranger to the language of this place. The proper course for me, members of the jury, is to deal first with the earliest charges that have been falsely brought against me, and with my earliest accusers, and then with the later ones. I make this distinction because I have already been accused in your hearing by a great many people for a great many years, though without a word of truth. And I am more afraid of those people than I am of Anytus and his colleagues, although they are formidable enough. But the others are still more formidable. I mean the people who took hold of so many of you when you were children and tried to fill your minds with untrue accusations against me, saying, there is a clever man called Socrates who has theories about the heavens and who has investigated everything below the earth and can make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. It is these people, my fellow citizens, the disseminators of these rumors who are my dangerous accusers, because those who hear them suppose that anyone who inquires into such matters must be an atheist. And the most fantastic thing of all is that it is impossible for me even to know and tell you their names, unless one of them happens to be a playwright. All these people who have tried to set you against me out of envy and love of slander, and some, too, merely passing on what they've been told by others, all these are very difficult to deal with. It is impossible to bring them here for cross-examination. One simply has to conduct one's defense and argue one's case against an invisible opponent, because there is no one to answer. Very well, then. I must begin my defense, my fellow Athenians. And I must try in the short time that I have to rid your minds of a false impression which is the work of many years. However, let that turn out as God wills. I must obey the law and make my defense. Let us go back to the beginning and consider what the charge is that has made me so unpopular and has encouraged Miletus to draw up this indictment. Very well. What did my critics say in attacking my character? I must read out their affidavits, so to speak, as though they were my legal accusers. Socrates is guilty of criminal meddling, in that he inquires into things below the earth and in the sky, and makes the weaker argument defeat the stronger, and teaches others to follow his example. It runs something like that. You have seen it for yourself in the play by Aristophanes, where Socrates goes whirling around proclaiming that he is walking on air and uttering a great deal of other nonsense about things of which I know nothing whatsoever. I mean no disrespect for such knowledge, if anyone really is versed in it. I don't want any more lawsuits brought against me by Miletus. But the fact is that I take no interest in it. What is more, I call upon the greater part of you as witnesses to my statement, and I appeal to all of you who have ever listened to me talking, and there are a great many here to whom this applies, to clear your neighbors' minds on this point. Tell one another whether any one of you has ever heard me discuss such questions briefly or at length, and then you will realize that the other popular reports about me are equally unreliable. Well, here, perhaps one of you might interrupt me and say, "But what is it that you do, Socrates? How is it that you have been misrepresented like this?" Well, this seems to me to be a reasonable request. Perhaps some of you will think that I am not being serious, but I assure you that I am going to tell you the whole truth. I have gained this reputation from nothing more or less than a kind of wisdom. What kind of wisdom do I mean? Well, human wisdom, I suppose. It seems that I really am wise in this limited sense. And now, gentlemen, please do not interrupt me if I seem to make an extravagant claim. For what I am going to tell you is not my own opinion. I am going to refer you to an unimpeachable authority. I shall call as witness to my wisdom, such as it is, the god at Delphi. You know Chierephon, of course. He was a friend of mine from boyhood and a good Democrat. And you know how enthusiastic he was over anything that he had once undertaken. Well, one day he actually went to Delphi and asked this question of the god, whether there was anyone wiser than myself. The priestess replied that there was no one. Now, please consider my object in telling you this. I want to explain to you how the attack upon my reputation first started. When I heard about the oracle's answer, I said to myself, what does the god really mean? I am only too conscious that I have no claim to wisdom, great or small. So what can he mean by asserting that I am the wisest man in the world? Oh, he cannot be telling a lie. That would not be right for him. After puzzling about it for some time, I set myself at last, with considerable reluctance, to check the truth of it. I approached a man with a high reputation for wisdom, because I felt that here, if anywhere, I should succeed in disproving the oracle and pointing out to my divine authority, "You said that I was the wisest of men, but here is a man who is wiser than I am." Well, I gave a thorough examination to this person. I need not mention his name, but it was one of our politicians that I was studying when I had this experience. And in conversation with him, I formed the impression that although in many people's opinion, and especially in his own, he appeared to be wise, in fact, he was not. Then, when I began to try to show him that he only thought he was wise and was not really so, my efforts were resented, both by him and by many of other people present. However, I reflected as I walked away, well, I am certainly wiser than this man. It is only too likely that neither of us has any knowledge to boast of, but he thinks that he knows something which he does not know, whereas I am quite conscious of my ignorance. At any rate, it seems that I am wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think that I know what I do not know. After this, I went on to interview a man with an even greater reputation for wisdom, and I formed the same impression again. And here, too, I incurred the resentment of the man himself and a number of others. From that time on, I interviewed one person after another. I realized with distress and alarm that I was making myself unpopular, but I felt compelled to put my religious duty first. Since I was trying to find out the meaning of the oracle, I was bound to interview everyone who had a reputation for knowledge. My honest impression was this. It seemed to me, as I pursued my investigation at the God's command, that the people with the greatest reputations were almost entirely deficient, while others, who were supposed to be their inferiors, were much better qualified in practical intelligence. I want you to think of my adventures as a sort of pilgrimage undertaken to establish the truth of the oracle once for all. After I had finished with the politicians, I turned to the poets, dramatic, lyric, and all the rest, in the belief that here I should expose myself as a comparative ignoramus. I used to pick up what I thought were some of their most perfect works and question them closely about the meaning of what they'd written, in the hope of incidentally enlarging my own knowledge. Well, I hesitate to tell you the truth, but it must be told. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that any of the bystanders could have explained those poems better than their actual authors. So, I made up my mind about the poets, too. I decided that it was not wisdom that enabled them to write their poetry, but a kind of instinct or inspiration, such as you find in seers and prophets who deliver all their sublime messages without knowing in the least what they mean. I also observed that the very fact that they were poets made them think that they had a perfect understanding of all other subjects, of which they were totally ignorant. So, I left that line of inquiry, too, with the same sense of advantage that I had felt in the case of the politicians. Last of all, I turned to the skilled craftsmen. I knew quite well that I had practically no technical qualifications myself, and I was sure that I should find them full of impressive knowledge. In this, I was not disappointed. They understood things which I did not, and to that extent they were wiser than I was. But these professional experts seemed to share the same failing which I had noticed in the poets. I mean that on the strength of their technical proficiency, they claimed a perfect understanding of every other subject, however important. and I felt that this error more than outweighed their positive wisdom. So I made myself spokesman for the oracle, and asked myself whether I would rather be as I was, neither wise with their wisdom nor stupid with their stupidity, or possess both qualities as they did. I replied through myself to the oracle that it was best for me to be as I was. The effect of these investigations of mine has been to arouse against me a great deal of hostility, and hostility of a particularly bitter and persistent kind, which has resulted in various malicious suggestions, including the description of me as a professor of wisdom. This is due to the fact that whenever I succeed in disproving another person's claim to wisdom in a given subject, the bystanders assume that I know everything about that subject myself. But the truth of the matter is pretty certainly this, that real wisdom is the property of God. And this oracle is his way of telling us that human wisdom has little or no value. It seems to me that he is not referring literally to Socrates. He has merely taken my name as an example, as if he would say to us, the wisest of you men is he who has realized, like Socrates, that in respect of wisdom, he is really worthless. That is why I still go about seeking and searching in obedience to the divine command. If I think that anyone is wise, whether citizen or stranger, and when I think that any person is not wise, I try to help the cause of God by proving that he is not. And this occupation has kept me too busy to do much either in politics or in my own affairs. In fact, my service to God has reduced me to extreme poverty. There is another reason for my being unpopular. A number of young men with wealthy fathers and plenty of leisure have deliberately attached themselves to me because they enjoy hearing other people cross-questioned. These often take me as their model and go on to try to question other persons, whereupon I suppose they find an unlimited number of people who think that they know something but really know little or nothing. Consequently, their victims become annoyed, not with themselves, but with me. And they complain that there is a pestilential busybody called Socrates who fills these young people's heads with wrong ideas. If you ask them what he does and what he teaches that has this effect, they have no answer, not knowing what to say. But as they do not want to admit their confusion, they fall back on the stock charges against any philosopher, that he teaches his pupils about things in the heavens and below the earth, and to disbelieve in gods, and to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. They would be very loath, I fancy, to admit the truth, which is that they are entirely ignorant. So jealous, I suppose, for their own reputation, and also energetic and numerically strong, and provided with a plausible and carefully worked out case against me, these people have been dinning into your ears for a long time past their violent denunciations of myself. Well, there you have the true facts, which I present to you without any concealment or suppression, great or small. I'm fairly certain that this plain speaking of mine is the cause of my unpopularity. And this really goes to prove that my statements are true, and that I have described correctly the nature and the grounds of the calumny which has been brought against me. Whether you inquire into them now or later, you will find the facts as I have just described them. So much for my defense against the charges brought by the first group of my accusers. I shall now try to defend myself against Miletus, high-principled and patriotic as he claims to be, and after that against the rest. Let us first consider their deposition again. as though it represented a fresh prosecution. It runs something like this. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the minds of the young and of believing in deities of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state. Such is the charge. Let us examine its points one by one. First, it says that I am guilty of corrupting the young. Tell me seriously, Meletus, is it better to live in a good or in a bad community? No, answer my question like a good fellow. There is nothing difficult about it. Is it not true that wicked people have a bad effect upon those with whom they are in the closest contact, and that good people have a good effect?
Quite true.
Is there anyone who prefers to be harmed rather than benefited by his associates? Answer me, my good man. The law commands you to answer. Is there anyone who prefers to be harmed?
Of course not.
Well then, when you summon me before this court for corrupting the young and making their characters worse, do you mean that I do so intentionally or unintentionally?
I mean intentionally.
Why, Meletus? Are you at your age so much wiser than I at mine? You have discovered that bad people always have a bad effect and good people a good effect upon their nearest neighbors. Am I so hopelessly ignorant as not even to realize that by spoiling the character of one of my companions I shall run the risk of getting some harm from him? Because nothing else would make me commit this grave offense intentionally. No, I do not believe it, Meletus. And I do not suppose that anyone else does. Either I have not a bad influence or it is unintentional, so that in either case your accusation is false. And if I unintentionally have a bad influence, the correct procedure in cases of such involuntary misdemeanors is not to summon the culprit before this court, but to take him aside privately for instruction and reproof. Because, obviously, if my eyes are opened, I shall stop doing what I do not intend to do. But you deliberately avoided my company in the past and refused to enlighten me. And now you bring me before this court, which is the place appointed for those who need punishment, not for those who need enlightenment. It is quite clear by now, members of the jury, that Meletus, as I said before, has never shown any degree of interest in this subject. However, I invite you to tell us, Meletus, in what sense you make out that I corrupt the minds of the young. Surely the terms of your indictment made it clear that you accuse me of teaching them to believe in new deities instead of the gods recognized by the state. Is not that the teaching of mine which you say has this demoralizing effect?
That is precisely what I maintain.
Then I appeal to you, Meletus, in the name of these same gods about whom we are speaking, to explain yourself a little more clearly to myself and to the jury, because I cannot make out what your point is. Is it that I teach people to believe in some gods, which implies that I myself believe in gods and am not a complete atheist, so that I am not guilty on that score, but in different gods from those recognized by the state, so that your accusation rests upon the fact that they are different? Or do you assert that I believe in no gods at all and teach others to do the same?
Yes, I say that you disbelieve in gods altogether.
You surprise me, Meletus. What is your object in saying that? Do you suggest that I do not believe that the sun and moon are gods, as is the general belief of all mankind?
He certainly does not, members of the jury, since he says that the sun is a stone and the moon a mass of earth.
My dear Meletus, have you so poor an opinion of these people? And do you assume them to be so illiterate as not to know that the writings of Anaxagoras are full of theories like these? And do you seriously suggest that it is from me that the young get these ideas, when they can buy them on occasion in the marketplace for a drachma at most, and so have the laugh on Socrates if he claims them for his own, to say nothing of their being so silly. Tell me honestly, Meletus, do I believe in no God?
No, none at all. Not in the slightest degree.
You are not at all convincing, Meletus, not even to yourself, I suspect. As a matter of fact, I do not feel that it requires much defense to clear myself of Meletus's accusation. What I have said already is enough. But you know very well the truth of what I said in an earlier part of my speech, that I have incurred a great deal of bitter hostility, and this is what will bring about my destruction, if anything does. Not Meletus, nor Anytus, but the slander and jealousy of a very large section of the people. They have been fatal to a great many other innocent men, and I suppose will continue to be so. There is no likelihood that they'll stop at me. But perhaps someone will say, do you feel no compunction, Socrates, at having followed a line of action which puts you in danger of the death penalty? I might fairly reply to him, you are mistaken, my friend, if you think that a man who is worth anything ought to spend his time weighing up the prospects of life and death. He has only one thing to consider in performing any action. That is, whether he is acting rightly or wrongly, like a good man or a bad one. On your view, the heroes who died at Troy would be poor creatures. The truth of the matter is this. Where a man has once taken up his stand, either because it seems best for him or in obedience to his orders, there I believe he is bound to remain and face the danger, taking no account of death or anything else before dishonor. This being so, it would be shocking inconsistency on my part if, when God appointed me, as I suppose and believe, to the duty of leading the philosophic life, examining myself and others, I were then, through fear of death or of any other danger, to desert my post. That would indeed be shocking. And then I might really, with justice, be summoned into court for not believing in the gods, and disobeying the oracle, and being afraid of death, and thinking that I am wise when I am not. It is my belief that no greater good has ever befallen you in this city than my service to my God. For I spend all my time going about trying to persuade you, young and old, to make your first and chief concern not for your bodies, nor for your possessions, but for the highest welfare of your souls. I'm going to tell you something else. I do not believe that the law of God permits a better man to be harmed by a worse. No doubt my accuser might put me to death or have me banished or deprived of civic rights. But even if he thinks, as he probably does, and others too, I dare say, that these are great calamities, I do not think so. I believe that it is far worse to do what he is doing now, trying to put an innocent man to death. For this reason, so far from pleading on my own behalf, as might be supposed, I am really pleading on yours to save you from misusing the gift of God by condemning me. If you put me to death, you will not easily find anyone to take my place. It is literally true, even if it sounds rather comical, that God has specially appointed me to this city, as though it were a large thoroughbred horse, which because of its great size is inclined to be lazy and needs the stimulation of some stinging fly. It seems to me that God has attached me to this city to perform the office of such a gadfly. And all day long I never cease to settle here, there, and everywhere, rousing, persuading, reproving every one of you. You will not easily find another like me, and if you take my advice, you will spare my life. And busying myself in people's private affairs, and yet never venture publicly to address you as a whole and advise on matters of state? The reason for this is what you have often heard me say before on many other occasions, that I am subject to a divine or supernatural experience, which Meletus saw fit to travesty in his indictment. It began in my early childhood, a sort of voice which comes to me. And when it comes, it always dissuades me from what I am proposing to do and never urges me on. It is this that debars me from entering public life, and a very good thing too, in my opinion. Because you may be quite sure that if I had tried long ago to engage in politics, I should long ago have lost my life, without doing any good either to you or to myself. Now, please do not be offended if I tell you the truth. No man on earth who conscientiously opposes either you or any other organized democracy and flatly prevents a great many wrongs and illegalities from taking place in the state to which he belongs can possibly escape with his life. The true champion of justice, if he intends to survive, even for a short time, must necessarily confine himself to private life and leave politics alone. You will find that throughout my life I have been consistent in any public duties that I have performed, and the same also in my personal dealings. I have never countenanced any action that was incompatible with justice on the part of any person, including those whom some people maliciously call my pupils. I have never set up as any man's teacher. But if anyone, young or old, is eager to hear me conversing and carrying out my private mission, I never grudge him the opportunity. Nor do I charge a fee for talking to him, refusing to talk without one. I am ready to answer questions for rich and poor alike, and I am equally ready if anyone prefers to listen to me and answer my questions. If any given one of these people becomes a good citizen or a bad one, I cannot fairly be held responsible, since I have never promised or imparted any teaching to anybody. And if anyone asserts that he has ever learned or heard from me privately anything which was not open to everyone else, you may be quite sure that he is not telling the truth. But how is it that some people enjoy spending a great deal of time in my company? You have heard the reason. I told you quite frankly. It is because they enjoy hearing me examine those who think that they are wise when they are not. An experience which has its amusing side. This duty I have accepted, as I said, in obedience to God's commands given in oracles and dreams, and in every other way that any other divine dispensation has ever impressed a duty upon man. This is a true statement and easy to verify. I leave it to you and to God to judge me as it shall be best, for me and for yourselves.
Crisis tudemu. Adicei Socrates.
The 501 members of the jury have now voted. 221 voted for acquittal, 280 for conviction. Socrates has therefore been found guilty. When the verdict was guilty, and as in the present case there was no fixed penalty, the plaintiff proposed one, the defendant another, and the jury then voted between the two proposals. Meletus proposed the penalty of death.
Stemia thanatos.
There are a great many reasons, my fellow Athenians, why I'm not distressed by this result. I mean, your condemnation of me. But the chief one is that the result was not unexpected. What does surprise me is the number of votes cast on the two sides. I should never have believed that it would be such a close thing. However, we must face the fact that Meletus demands the death penalty. Very good. What alternative penalty shall I propose to you, members of the jury? Obviously, it must be adequate. Well, what penalty do I deserve to pay or suffer in view of what I've done? I have never lived an ordinary, quiet life. I did not care for the things that most people care about. Making money, having a comfortable home, high military or civil rank, and all the other activities which go on in our city. I thought that I was really too strict in my principles to survive if I went in for this sort of thing. So, I set myself to do you individually in private what I hold to be the greatest possible service. I tried to persuade each of you not to think more of practical advantages than of his mental and moral well-being, or in general, to think more of advantage than of well-being in the case of the state or of anything else. What do I deserve for behaving in this way? Some reward, if I am bound to suggest what I really deserve, and what is more, a reward which would be appropriate for myself. Well, what is appropriate for a poor man who is a public benefactor and who requires leisure for giving you moral encouragement? Nothing could be more appropriate for such a person than free maintenance at the state's expense. Or perhaps when I say this, I may give you the impression that I am showing a deliberate perversity. That is not so. The real reason is this. I am convinced that I never wrong anyone intentionally. But I cannot convince you of this because we've had so little time for discussion. It is not easy to dispose of grave allegations in a short space of time. So being convinced that I do no wrong to anybody, I can hardly be expected to wrong myself by asserting that I deserve something bad, or by proposing a corresponding penalty. Why should I? For fear of suffering this penalty proposed by Meletus, when, as I said, I do not know whether it is a good thing or a bad, do you expect me to choose something which I know very well is bad by making my counter-proposal? Imprisonment? Why should I spend my days in prison? A fine with imprisonment until it is paid? In my case, the effect would be just the same, because I have no money to pay a fine. Or shall I suggest Punishment. You would very likely accept the suggestion, but I should have to be desperately in love with life to accept that. I'm not so blind that I cannot see that you, my fellow citizens, have come to the end of your patience with my discussions and conversations. You have found them too irksome and irritating, and now you are trying to get rid of them. Will any other people find them easy to put up with? That is most unlikely. A fine life I should have if I left this country at my age and spent the rest of my days trying one city after another and being turned out every time. I know very well that wherever I go, the young people will listen to my conversation just as they do here. And if I try to keep them off, they will make their elders drive me out. While if I do not, the fathers and other relatives will drive me out of their own accord for the sake of the young. Perhaps someone will say, but surely, Socrates, after you've left us, you can spend the rest of your life in quietly minding your own business. This is the hardest thing of all to make some of you understand. If I say that this would be disobedience to God, and that is why I cannot mind my own business, you will not believe that I am serious. If, on the other hand, I tell you that to let no day pass without discussing goodness and all the other subjects about which you hear me talking, and examining both myself and others, is really the very best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living, you will be even less inclined to believe me. Nevertheless, that is how it is, as I maintain. No, it is not easy to convince you of it. Besides, I am not accustomed to think of myself as deserving punishment. I suppose I could probably afford 100 drachmas. I suggest a fine of that amount.
Socrates, I'll put up 1,000, and Crito is willing to put up another 1,000.
Yes, Socrates, 1,000 from me, too, and the same from me.
One moment, please. Please. These friends of mine, Plato here, and Crito, and Critobulus, and Apollodorus, want me to propose 3,000 drachmas on their security. Very well, I agree to this sum. And you can rely upon these gentlemen for its payment.
Chrysis Tudemu. Demia Thanatos.
The 501 members of the jury now cast their votes again. Apparently 80 more than had found him guilty now favor death. So 360 voted for the death penalty and only 141 for the fine.
Demia Thanatos.
Well, members of the jury, If you had waited just a little longer, you would have had your way in the course of nature. You can see that I am well on in life and near to death. I am saying this not to all of you, but to those who voted for my execution. And I have something else to say to them as well. No doubt you think, sirs, that I have been condemned for lack of the arguments which I could have used if I had thought it right to leave nothing unsaid or undone to secure my acquittal. But that is very far from the truth. It is not my lack of arguments that has caused my condemnation, but my lack of effrontery and impudence. In a court of law, just as in warfare, neither I nor any other ought to use his wits to escape death by any means. The difficulty is not so much to escape death. The real difficulty is to escape from doing wrong, which is far more fleet of foot. In this present instance, I, the slow old man, have been overtaken by the slower of the two. But my accusers, who are clever and quick, have been overtaken by the faster, by iniquity. When I leave this court, I shall go away condemned by you to death, but they will go away convicted by truth herself of depravity and wickedness. And they accept their sentence even as I accept mine. No doubt it was bound to be so. And I think that the result is fair enough. Having said so much, I feel moved to prophesy to you who have given your vote against me. For I am now at that point where the gift of prophecy comes most readily to men, at the point of death. I tell you, my executioners, that as soon as I am dead, vengeance shall fall upon you with a punishment far more painful than your killing of me. You have brought about my death in the belief that through it you will be delivered from submitting your conduct to criticism. But I say that the result will be just the opposite. You will have more critics, whom up till now I have restrained without your knowing it. And being younger, they will be harsher to you and will cause you more annoyance. If you expect to stop denunciation of your wrong way of life by putting people to death, there is something amiss with your reasoning. This way of escape is neither possible nor creditable. The best and easiest way is not to stop the mouths of others, but to make yourselves as good men as you can. This is my last message to you who voted for my condemnation. As for you who voted for my acquittal, I should very much like to say a few words to reconcile you to the result. While the officials are busy and I am not yet on my way to the place where I must die, I ask you, gentlemen, to spare me these few moments. There is no reason why we should not exchange fancies while the law permits. I look upon you as my friends, and I want you to understand the right way of regarding my present position. Gentlemen of the jury, for you deserve to be so called, I have had a remarkable experience. In the past, the prophetic voice to which I have become accustomed has always been my constant companion, opposing me even in quite trivial things if I was going to take the wrong course. Now, something has happened to me, as you can see, which might be thought and is commonly considered to be a supreme calamity. Yet neither when I left home this morning, nor when I was taking my place here in the court, nor at any point in any part of my speech, did the divine sign oppose me. Death is one of two things. Either it is annihilation and the dead have no consciousness of anything, or as we are told, it is really a change, a migration of the soul from this place to another. Now, if there is no consciousness but only a dreamless sleep, death must be a marvelous gain. I suppose that if anyone were told to pick out the night on which he slept so soundly as not even to dream, and then to compare it with all the other nights and days of his life, and then were told to say, after due consideration, how many better and happier days and nights than this he had spent in the course of his life, well, I think that he would find these days and nights easy to count in comparison with the rest. If death is like this, then I call it gain. Because the whole of time, if you look at it in this way, can be regarded as no more than one single night. If, on the other hand, death is a removal from here to some other place, and if what we are told is true, that all the dead are there, what greater blessing could there be than this, gentlemen, if, on arrival in the other world, beyond the reach of our so-called justice, one will find there the true judges who are said to preside in those courts? Would that be an unrewarding journey? How much would one of you give to meet Orpheus and Homer? It would be a specially interesting experience for me to join them there. You too, gentlemen of the jury, must look forward to death with confidence, and fix your minds on this one belief, which is certain, that nothing can harm a good man, either in life or after death, and his fortunes are not a matter of indifference to the gods. This present experience of mine has not come about mechanically. I am quite clear that the time had come when it was better for me to die and be released from my distractions. That is why my sign never turned me back. For my own part, I bear no grudge at all against those who have condemned me and accused me, although it was not with this kind intention that they did so, but because they thought that they were hurting me, and that is culpable of them. However, I ask them to grant me one favor. When my sons grow up, if you think that they are putting money or anything else before goodness, take your revenge by plaguing them as I plagued you. And if they fancy themselves for no reason, you must scold them just as I scolded you for neglecting the important things and thinking that they are good for something when they are good for nothing. If you do this, I shall have had justice at your hands, both I myself and my children. Now it is time that we were going. I to die, and you to live. But which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God.
Part 1 of The Last Days of Socrates by Plato was edited for radio by David Rees from the translation by Hugh Tredennick. Socrates was Leo McKern. Euthyphro was played by Trevor Nichols, and Miletus by Colin Starkey. The members of the Athenian jury were Peter Aker, Graham Blockey, Bernard Brown, Christopher Douglas, John Forbes Robertson, Cyril Luckham, John Rye, William Hope, David Sinclair, Brian Smith, and Alan Thompson. The music was composed and conducted by Christos Pitas. The Last Days of Socrates was directed by John Theocharis. And we conclude the two-part dramatization of the 4 dialogues in which Plato gives a vivid account of the last days of Socrates. The Last Days of Socrates, with Leo McKern. Part 2.
Ara Dei, pantos peithestai tois nomois?
In Athens, sentence of execution was normally carried out at once. But the day before Socrates' trial was also the first day of the annual mission to Delos, a ceremony to commemorate the exploit of Theseus when he delivered Athens from the yearly tribute of sending young men and women as food for the Cretan Minotaur. While the state galley was absent on this mission, the death penalty could not be inflicted. This year the mission took so long that Socrates was kept in prison for a month, awaiting the day of his execution. Some delay must have been foreseen, and it's possible that Socrates' enemies expected or intended that he should escape and leave the country. His own wealthy friends certainly urged him to do so, as they felt that he had sacrificed himself and them too easily. Socrates in prison.
Socrates ento desmoterio.
A room in the state prison of Athens in the year 399 BC. The time is half an hour before dawn. On a pallet bed against the back wall lies Socrates asleep. Crito, one of his oldest friends, sits patiently on a stool.
here already, Crito? Surely it's still early.
Indeed it is.
Well, what time?
Just before dawn.
Oh, surprised the warder agreed to let you in.
He's used to me now, Socrates, because I come here so often. Besides, he's under some small obligation to me.
Oh, have you only just come?
No, I've been here some time.
Why didn't you wake me up at once instead of sitting by my bed so quietly?
I wouldn't dream of such a thing, Socrates. I only wish I were not so sleepless and depressed myself.
Oh?
I've been wondering at you because I saw how comfortably you were sleeping, and I deliberately didn't wake you because I wanted you to go on being as comfortable as you could. I've often felt before in the course of my life how fortunate you are in your disposition, but I feel it more than ever now in your present misfortune when I see how easily and placidly you put up with it.
Oh, well, really, Crito, it would be hardly suitable for a man of my age to resent having to die.
Well, other people just as old as you get involved in these misfortunes, Socrates, but their age doesn't keep them from resenting it when they find themselves in your position.
Crito, why have you come so early?
Because I bring bad news, Socrates.
Has the boat come in from Delos?
It hasn't actually come in yet, but I expect that it'll be here today. And so by tomorrow, Socrates, you will have to end your life.
Well, Crito, I hope it may be for the best. If the gods will it so, so be it. All the same, I don't think it will arrive today.
Well, what makes you think that?
Am I right in saying that I have to die on the day after the boat arrives?
Well, that's what the authorities say, at any rate.
And I don't think it will arrive on this day that is just beginning, but on the day after.
Oh?
I'm going by a dream that I had in the night, only a little while ago.
Why, what was the dream about?
I thought I saw a gloriously beautiful woman dressed in white robes. She came up to me and said, "Socrates, to the pleasant land of here, on the third day shalt thou come."
Now, look here, Socrates. It's still not too late to take my advice and escape. Now, your death means a double calamity for me. I shall not only lose a friend whom I can never possibly replace, but besides, a great many people who don't know you and me very well will be sure to think that I let you down, because I could have saved you if I'd been willing to spend the money. And what could be more contemptible than to get a name for thinking more of money than of your friends? Most people will never believe that you refused to leave this place, although we tried our hardest to persuade you.
But, my dear Crito, why should we pay so much attention to what most people think? The really reasonable people who have more claim to be considered will believe the facts to be exactly as they are.
But you can see for yourself, Socrates, that one has to think of popular opinion as well. Your present position is quite enough to show that the capacity of ordinary people for causing trouble is not confined to petty annoyances, but has hardly any limits if you once get a bad name with them.
I only wish that ordinary people had an unlimited capacity for doing harm. Then they might have an unlimited power for doing good, which would be a splendid thing. Actually, they have neither. They cannot make a man wise or stupid. They simply act at random.
Oh, have it that way if you like. But tell me this, Socrates. I hope that you aren't worrying about the possible effects on me and the rest of your friends, and thinking that if you escape, we shall have trouble with informers for having helped you to get away, and have to forfeit all our property, or pay an enormous fine, or even incur some further punishment. If any idea like that is troubling you, you can dismiss it altogether. We are quite entitled to run that risk in saving you, and even worse if necessary. Take my advice and be reasonable.
All that you say is very much in my mind, Crito. and a great deal more besides.
Very well, then. Don't let it distress you. I know some people who are willing to rescue you from here and get you out of the country for quite a moderate sum. And then surely you realize how cheap these informers are to buy off. We shan't need much money to settle them, and I think you've got enough of my money for yourself already. And then, even supposing that in your anxiety for my safety you feel that you oughtn't to spend my money, there are these foreign friends of ours staying in Athens who are quite willing to spend theirs. One of them, Simmias of Thebes, has actually brought the money with him for this very purpose. And Cebes and a number of others are quite ready to do the same. So, as I say, you mustn't let any fears on these grounds make you slacken your efforts to escape. And you mustn't feel any misgivings about what you said at your trial, that you wouldn't know what to do with yourself if you left this country. Wherever you go, there are plenty of places where you will find a welcome. Besides, Socrates, I don't even feel that it is right for you to try to do what you are doing, throwing away your life when you might save it. You're doing your best to treat yourself in exactly the same way as your enemies would, or rather did, when they wanted to ruin you. What is more, it seems to me that you are letting your sons down, too. You have it in your power to finish their upbringing and education, and instead of that, you are proposing to go off and desert them, and so far as you are concerned, they'll have to take their chance. And what sort of chance are they likely to get? The sort of thing that usually happens to orphans when they lose their parents. Either one ought not to have children at all, or one ought to see their upbringing and education through to the end. It strikes me that you are taking the line of least resistance, whereas you ought to make the choice of a good man and a brave one, considering that you profess to have made goodness your object all through life. Really, I am ashamed, both on your account and on ours, your friends. It'll look as though we had played something like a coward's part all through this affair of yours. First, there was your decision to come to court when it was quite unnecessary. Then there was the conduct of the defense. And finally, to complete the farce, we get this situation, which makes it appear that we've let you slip out of our hands through some lack of courage and enterprise on our part, because we didn't save you and you didn't save yourself, when it would have been quite possible and practicable. There, Socrates, if you aren't careful, besides the suffering, there will be all this disgrace for you and us to bear. Now come, make up your mind. Really, it's too late for that now. You ought to have made it up already. There is no alternative. The whole thing must be carried through during this coming night. If we lose any more time, it can't be done. It'll be too late. I appeal to you, Socrates, on every ground. Take my advice and please don't be unreasonable.
Oh, my very dear Crito, I appreciate your warm feelings very much. That is, assuming that they have some justification. If not, the stronger they are, the harder they will be to deal with. Very well, then. We must consider whether we ought to follow your advice or not. You know, this is not a new idea of mine. It has always been my nature never to accept advice from any of my friends unless reflection shows that it is the best course that reason offers. I cannot abandon the principles which I used to hold in the past simply because this accident has happened to me. They seem to me to be much as they were, and I respect and regard the same principles now as before. So, unless we can find better principles on this occasion, you can be quite sure that I shall not agree with you.
No.
Well then, how can we consider the question most reasonably? Suppose that we begin by reverting to this view which you hold about people's opinions. Was it always right to argue that some opinions should be taken seriously, but not others? Or was it always wrong? Perhaps it was right before the question of my death arose. But now we can see clearly that it was a mistaken persistence in a point of view which was really irresponsible nonsense. I should like very much to inquire into this problem, Kreiter, with your help, and to see whether the argument will appear in any different light to me now that I am in this position, or whether it will remain the same, and whether we shall dismiss it or accept it. Serious thinkers, I believe, have always held some such view as the one which I mentioned just now, that some of the opinions which people entertain should be respected and others should not. Now I ask you, Kreiter, don't you think that this is a sound principle? You are safe from the prospect of dying tomorrow, in all human probability, and you are not likely to have your judgment upset by this impending calamity. So consider then. Don't you think that this is a sound enough principle, that one should not regard all the opinions that people hold, but only some and not others? Well, what do you say? Isn't that a fair statement?
Yes, it is.
In other words, one should regard the good ones and not the bad.
Yes.
The opinions of the wise being good, the opinions of the foolish bad.
Naturally.
To pass on then. Do you remember the illustration that I used to employ? When a man is in training and taking it seriously, does he pay attention to all praise and criticism and opinion indiscriminately? Or only when it comes from the one qualified person, the actual doctor or trainer?
Only when it comes from the one qualified person.
Then he should be afraid of the criticism and welcome the praise of the one qualified person, but not those of the general public. Well, now, tell me, Kreiter, does this apply as a general rule and above all to the sort of actions which we're trying to decide about? Just and unjust, honorable and dishonorable, good and bad? Ought we to be guided and intimidated by the opinion of the many, or by that of the one, assuming that there is some one with expert knowledge? Is it true that we ought to respect and fear this person more than all the rest put together, and that if we do not follow his guidance, we shall spoil and mutilate that part of us which, as we used to say, is improved by right conduct and destroyed by wrong? Or is this all nonsense?
No, I think it is true, Socrates.
Then consider the next step. There is a part of us which is improved by healthy actions and ruined by unhealthy ones. If we spoil it by taking the advice of non-experts, will life be worth living when this part is once ruined? And the part I mean is the body. Do you accept it?
Yes.
Well, is life worth living with a body which is worn out and ruined in health?
Certainly not.
What about that part of us which is mutilated by wrong actions and benefited by right ones? Is life worth living with this part ruined? Or do we believe that this part of us, whatever it might be, in which right and wrong operate, is of less importance than the body?
Oh, certainly not.
Is it really more precious?
Oh, much more.
In that case, my dear fellow, what we ought to consider is not so much what people in general will say about us, but how we stand with the expert in right and wrong, the one authority who represents the actual truth. So, in the first place, your proposition is not correct when you say that we should consider popular opinion in questions of what is right and honorable and good, or the opposite. Of course, one might object and say, all the same, the people have the power to put us to death.
No doubt about that. It's quite true, Socrates. It is a possible objection.
But so far as I can see, my dear fellow, the argument which we have just been through is quite unaffected by it. At the same time, I should like you to consider whether we are still satisfied on this point, that the really important thing is not simply to live, but to live well.
Ah, yes.
And that to live well means the same thing as to live honorably or rightly.
Yes.
Then, in the light of this agreement, we must consider whether or not it is right for me to try to get away without an official discharge. If it turns out to be right, we must make the attempt. If not, we must let it drop.
Well, I agree with what you say, Socrates, but I wish you would consider what we ought to do.
Let us look at it together, my dear fellow. And if you can challenge any of my arguments, do so, and I will listen to you. But if you can't, be a good fellow and stop telling me over and over again that I ought to leave this place without official permission. I'm very anxious to obtain your approval before I adopt the course which I have in mind. I don't want to act against your convictions. So now give your attention to the starting point of this inquiry. I hope that you will be satisfied with my way of stating it, and try to answer the questions to the best of your judgment.
Well, I will try.
Do we say that one must never willingly do wrong, or does it depend upon circumstances? Is it true, as we have often agreed before, that there is no sense in which wrongdoing is good or honorable?
Yes, it is.
Then in no circumstances must one do wrong.
No.
And though most people believe the opposite, one must not even do wrong when one is wrong oneself.
Apparently not.
Ought one to do injuries or not?
Oh, surely not, Socrates.
So, it is never right to do a wrong, or return a wrong, or defend oneself against injury by retaliation. I have held this for a long time and still hold it. But if you have formed any other opinion, say so and tell me what it is. If, on the other hand, you stand by what we have said, listen to my next point.
Yes, I stand by it and agree with you.
Well, here is my next question.
Go on.
Ought one to fulfill all one's agreements, provided that they are right, or break them?
One ought to fulfill them.
Then consider the logical consequence. If we leave this place without first persuading the state to let us go, are we or are we not doing an injury, and doing it in a quarter where it is least justifiable? Are we or are we not abiding by our agreements?
I can't answer your question, Socrates. I am not clear in my mind.
Look at it this way. Suppose that while we were preparing to run away from here, we were suddenly confronted by the laws and constitution of Athens, who asked us this question. Now, Socrates, what are you proposing to do? Can you deny that by this act which you are contemplating, you intend, so far as you have the power, to destroy us, the laws, and the whole state as well? Do you imagine that a city can continue to exist and not be turned upside down if the legal judgments which are pronounced in it have no force, but are nullified and destroyed by private persons? How shall we answer this question, Crito? Shall we say, yes, I do intend to destroy the laws because the state wronged me by passing a faulty judgment at my trial? Is this to be our answer, or what?
Exactly what you have said, Socrates.
Then, what supposing the law says? Was there provision for this in the agreement between you and us, Socrates? Or did you undertake to abide by whatever judgments the state pronounced? Come now, Socrates. What charge do you bring against us and the state that you are trying to destroy us? Did we not give you life in the first place? Was it not through us that your father married your mother and begot you? Tell us, have you any complaint against those of us laws that deal with marriage? No, none, I should say. Well, have you any against the laws which deal with children's upbringing and education, such as you had yourself? No, I should say. Very good. Then, since you have been born and brought up and educated, can you deny in the first place that you were our child and our servant? Both you and your ancestors? And if this is so, do you imagine that what is right for us is equally right for you? And that whatever we tried to do to you, you are justified in retaliating? You did not have equality of rights with your father or your employer to enable you to retaliate. You were not allowed to answer back when you were scolded or to hit back when you were beaten. Do you expect to have such license against your country and its laws that if we try to put you to death in the belief that it is the right thing to do, you on your part will try your hardest to destroy your country and us its laws in return? And will you, Socrates, the true devotee of goodness, claim that you are justified in doing so? Are you so wise as to have forgotten that compared with your mother and father and all the rest of your ancestors, your country is something far more precious, more venerable, more sacred, and held in greater honor both among gods and among all reasonable men? Do you not realize that you are even more bound to respect and placate the anger of your country than your father's anger? That if you cannot persuade your country, you must do whatever it orders, and patiently submit to any punishment that it imposes, whether it be flogging or imprisonment. And if it leads you out to war to be wounded or killed, you must comply. And it is right that you should do so. You must not give way or retreat or abandon your position, both in war and in the law courts and everywhere else. You must do whatever your city and your country commands, or else persuade it in accordance with universal justice. But violence is a sin, even against your parents, and it is a far greater sin against your country. Well, what shall we say to this, Crichton? That what the law says is true, or not?
Yes, I think so.
Consider then, Socrates, the laws would probably continue, that any Athenian, on attaining to manhood and seeing for himself the political organization of the state and us its laws, is permitted, if he is not satisfied with this, to take his property and go away wherever he likes. On the other hand, if any one of you stands his ground when he can see how we administer justice and the rest of our public organization, we hold that by doing so, he has in fact undertaken to do anything that we tell him. And we maintain that anyone who disobeys is guilty of doing wrong on 3 separate counts. First, because we are his parents. Secondly, because we are his guardians. And thirdly, because, after promising obedience, he is neither obeying us nor persuading us to change our decision, if we are at fault in any way. And although all our orders are in the form of proposals, not of savage commands, and we give him the choice of either persuading us or doing what we say, he is actually doing neither. These are the charges, Socrates, to which we say that you will be liable if you do what you are contemplating. And you will not be the least culpable of your fellow countrymen, but one of the most guilty. If I said, why do you say that? They would no doubt pounce upon me with perfect justice and point out that there are very few people in Athens who have entered into this agreement with them as explicitly as I have. But Socrates, they would say, we have substantial evidence that you are satisfied with us and with the state. You would not have been so exceptionally reluctant to cross the borders of your country if you had not been exceptionally attached to it. Furthermore, even at the time of your trial, you could have proposed the penalty of banishment if you had chosen to do so. That is, you could have done then, with the sanction of the state, what you are now trying to do without it. But whereas at that time you made a noble show of indifference if you had to die, and in fact preferred death, as you said, to banishment, now You show no respect for your earlier professions, and no regard for us, the laws, whom you are trying to destroy. You are behaving like the lowest type of menial, trying to run away in spite of the contracts and undertakings by which you agreed to live as a member of our state. Now first, answer this question, Socrates. Are we or are we not speaking the truth when we say that you have undertaken, indeed, if not in word, to live your life as a citizen in obedience to us? What are we to say to that, Crito? Are we not bound to admit it?
We cannot help it, Socrates.
Incidentally, they will say, Crito, incidentally, you will confirm the opinion of the jurors who tried you that they gave a correct verdict. Because a destroyer of laws might very well be supposed to have a destructive influence upon young and foolish human beings. Do you intend then to avoid well-governed states and the higher forms of human society? And if you do, will life be worth living? Or will you approach these people and have the impudence to converse with them? What arguments will you use, Socrates? The same which you used here, that goodness and integrity, institutions and laws are the most precious possessions of mankind. Do you not think that Socrates and everything about him will appear in a disreputable light? And will no one comment on the fact that an old man of your age, probably with only a short time left to live, should dare to cling so greedily to life at the price of violating the most stringent laws? No, Socrates. Be advised by us, your guardians, and do not think more of your children or of your life or of anything else than you think of what is right, so that when you enter the next world, you may have all this to plead in your defense before the authorities there. Do not take Crito's advice, Socrates, but follow ours. Yes, that, my dear friend Crito, I do assure you, is what I seem to hear them saying. Just as a mystic seems to hear the strains of music, and the sound of their arguments rings so loudly in my head that I cannot hear the other side. I warn you that as my opinion stands at present, it will be useless to urge a different view. However, if you think that you will do any good by it, say what you like.
No, Socrates. I have nothing to say.
Then give it up, Crito, and let us follow this course, since God points out the way.
Ea toinun o Kriton, kai pratomen taute, Epeide taute hoteos hyphegetai.
The last hours of Socrates, Phaedo.
Athanatos pe psyche, lege ho Socrates.
The state galley arrived back from Delos one evening, about a month after Socrates' trial. The following day he would be executed at nightfall. Those of his closest friends who were in Athens went to see and hear him for the last time. The story of that morning is told by an eyewitness, Phaedo of Elis, to a sympathetic young philosopher, Socrates. Their conversation takes place in Phlius, a little town in the northeast of the Peloponnese on the banks of the river Asopos.
Were you there with Socrates yourself, Phaedo? Or did you hear about it from someone else?
No, I was there myself, Socrates.
Were there any other of the master's companions present?
Oh, yes. Some of them were there. Quite a few, in fact.
I wish you'd be kind enough to give me a really detailed account.
Aye, Socrates. Nothing gives me more pleasure than recalling the memory of Socrates, either by talking myself or by listening to someone else.
Well, Phaedo, you will find that your audience feels just the same about it. Now, try to describe every detail as carefully as you can.
Well, in the first place, my own feelings at the time were quite extraordinary. It never occurred to me to feel sorry for him, as you might have expected me to feel at the deathbed of a very dear friend. The master seemed quite happy, Socrates, both in his manner and in what he said. He met his death so fearlessly, so nobly. I couldn't help feeling that even on his way to the other world, he would be under the providence of God, and that when he arrived there, all would be well with him, if it ever has been with anybody.
Yes.
So I felt no sorrow at all, as you might have expected on such a solemn occasion. And at the same time, I felt no pleasure at being occupied in our usual philosophical discussions. That was the form that our conversation took. I felt an absolutely incomprehensible emotion, a sort of curious blend of pleasure and pain combined, as my mind took it in that in a little while my friend was going to die. All of us who were there were affected in much the same way. Between laughing and crying, one of us in particular, Apollodorus, you know what he's like, don't you?
Of course I do.
Well, he quite lost control of himself. But I and the others were very much upset.
Who else was actually there, Phaedo?
Why, Apollodorus and Critobulus and his father Crito, and some other people from Athens. Plato, I believe, was ill.
Any visitors from outside?
Yes, Simmias of Thebes, with Cabes.
Oh, yes.
When we arrived, the porter, instead of letting us in as usual, told us to wait outside until he gave us the word. The commissioners are taking off Socrates' chains, he said, and warning him that he is to die today. After a short interval, he came back and told us to go in. When we went inside, we found Socrates just released from his chains, and Xantippe, you know her, sitting by him with a little boy, Menexenos, on her knee. As soon as Xantippe saw us, she broke out into the sort of remark you would expect from a woman. "Oh, Socrates, this is the last time that you and your friends will be able to talk together." Socrates looked at Crito. "Crito," he said, "someone had better take her home." Some of Crito's servants led her away, crying hysterically. Socrates sat up on the bed, drew up his leg, and massaged it.
What a strange thing it is, my friends, this sensation which is popularly called pleasure. It's remarkable how closely it's connected with its conventional opposite, pain. I had a pain in my leg from the fetters, and now they're gone. I feel the pleasure coming that follows it. Well, I suppose that for one who is soon to leave this world, there is no more suitable occupation than inquiring into our views about the future life and trying to imagine what it is like. What else can one do in the time before sunset?
Socrates.
What is it, Crito?
Only this, Socrates, that the man who is to give you the poison has been asking me for a long time to tell you to talk as little as possible. He says that talking makes you heated and that you ought not to do anything to affect the action of the poison. Otherwise, it is sometimes necessary to take a second dose or even a third.
Oh, my dear Crito, that is his affair. Let him make his own preparations for administering it twice or 3 times, if necessary.
I thought you'd say that. But he's been going on at me.
Never mind it. Now, I want to explain to you how it seems to me natural that a man who has really devoted his life to philosophy should be cheerful in the face of death and confident in finding the greatest blessing in the next world when his life is finished. I will try to make clear, and particularly to you, Simias and Kevis, how this can be so. Ordinary people seem not to realize that those who really apply themselves in the right way to philosophy are directly and of their own accord preparing themselves for dying and death. If this is true, and they have actually been looking forward to death all their lives, it would of course be absurd to be troubled when it comes.
Upon my word, Socrates, you have made me laugh, though I was not at all in the mood for it. I'm sure that if they heard what you said, most people would think that it was a very good hit at the philosophers to say that they're half dead already, and that they, the normal people, are quite aware that death would serve the philosophers right.
Yes. And they would be quite correct, Simias, except in thinking that they are quite aware. They're not at all aware in what sense true philosophers are half dead, or in what sense they deserve death, or what sort of death they deserve. So let's not bother about them. Do we believe that there is such a thing as death?
Most certainly, yes.
And is it simply the release of the soul from the body?
Yes, just that.
Well then, my boy, do you think that it is right for a philosopher to concern himself with the nominal pleasures connected with food and drink?
Certainly not, Socrates.
What about sexual pleasures?
No, not at all.
And what about things like providing himself with smart clothes and shoes and other bodily ornaments? Do you think that he values them or despises them?
I think the true philosopher despises them.
Then it is your opinion, in general, that a man of this kind is not concerned with the body, but keeps his attention directed as much as he can away from it and towards the soul.
Yes, it is.
So it is clear, first of all, in the case of physical pleasures, that the philosopher frees his soul from association with the body so far as is possible, to a greater extent than other men.
It seems so, yes.
And most people think, do they not, Simias, that the man who finds no pleasure and takes no part in these things does not deserve to live, and that anyone who thinks nothing of physical pleasures has one foot in the grave.
That is perfectly true.
Now take the acquisition of knowledge. Can we rely completely on human sight and hearing? Or is it true, as the poets are always dinning into our ears, that we neither hear nor see anything accurately? Yet if these senses are not clear and accurate, the rest can hardly be so, because they are all inferior to the first two.
Right.
Then when is it that the soul attains to truth? When it tries to investigate anything with the help of the body, it is obviously led astray.
Quite so.
Is it not in the course of reflection, if at all, that the soul gets a clear view of facts?
Yes.
Surely the soul can best reflect when it is free of all distractions, such as hearing or sight or pain or pleasure of any kind. That is, when it ignores the body and becomes as far as possible independent, avoiding all physical contacts and associations as much as it can, in its search for reality.
That is so.
Then here too, in despising the body and avoiding it and endeavoring to become independent, the philosopher's soul is ahead of all the rest.
It seems so.
Now then, do we recognize such a thing as absolute uprightness?
Indeed we do.
And absolute beauty and goodness too?
Of course.
Yes.
Have you ever seen the real nature of these things with your eyes?
Certainly not.
Isn't it true that in any inquiry you are likely to attain more nearly to knowledge of your object in proportion to the care and accuracy with which you have prepared yourself to understand that object in itself?
Certainly, yes.
Don't you think that the person who is likely to succeed in this attempt most perfectly is the man who pursues the truth by applying his pure and unadulterated thought to the pure and unadulterated object, cutting himself off as much as possible from his eyes and ears and virtually all the rest of his body as an impediment which by its presence prevents the soul from attaining to truth and clear thinking? Is not this the person, Simias, who will reach the goal of reality, if anyone can?
What you say is absolutely true, Socrates.
All these considerations must surely prompt serious philosophers to review the position in some such way as this. So long as we keep to the body and our soul is contaminated with this imperfection, there is no chance of our ever attaining satisfactorily to our object, which we assert to be truth. In the first place, the body provides us with innumerable distractions, owing to the nourishment it must have. Any diseases which attack us hinder our quest for reality. Besides, the body fills us with loves and desires and fears and all sorts of fancies and a great deal of nonsense, with the result that we literally never get an opportunity to think at all about anything.
Yes.
Whole wars are undertaken for the acquisition of wealth, and the reason why we have to acquire wealth is the body, because we are slaves in its service. That is why we have so little time for philosophy. It seems, therefore, that the wisdom which we desire and upon which we profess to set our hearts will be attainable only when we are dead. If no pure knowledge is possible in the company of the body, then either it is totally impossible to acquire knowledge, or it is only possible after death, because it is only then that the soul will be separate and independent of the body. Oh, don't you agree with me, Simmias?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Socrates.
So this journey, which is now ordained for me, carries a happy prospect for any other man also, who believes that his mind is prepared by having been, in a manner, purified.
It does indeed, yes.
And purification consists in separating the soul as much as possible from the body and accustoming it to withdraw from all contact with the body and concentrate itself by itself. The philosopher's occupation consists precisely in the freeing and separation of soul from body. Isn't that so?
Yes.
A man has trained himself throughout his life to live in a state as close as possible to death. Would it not be ridiculous for him to be distressed when death comes to him?
It would, of course.
Then it is a fact, Simmias, that true philosophers make dying their profession, and that to them, of all men, death is least alarming. Would they not naturally be glad to set out for the place where there is a prospect of attaining the object of their lifelong desire, which is wisdom? It is wisdom that makes possible courage and self-control and integrity, or, in a word, true goodness. And the presence or absence of pleasure and fears and other such feelings makes no difference at all. Whereas a system of morality which is based on relative emotional values is a mere illusion, a thoroughly vulgar conception which has nothing sound in it and nothing true. The true moral ideal, whether self-control or integrity or courage, is really a kind of purification of all these emotions. And wisdom itself is a sort of purifying ritual. Perhaps these people who direct the religious initiations are not so far from the mark. Well, in my opinion, these devotees, the true philosophers, are simply those who have lived the philosophic life in the right way. A company which all through my life I have done my best in every way to join. Whether I was right in this ambition, and whether we have achieved anything, we shall know for certain, if God wills, when we reach the other world. And that, I imagine, will be fairly soon.
There is also, Socrates, that theory which you've often described to us, that what we call learning is really just recollection.
Yes, Gabby.
Well, if that is true, then surely what we recollect now we must have learnt at some time before, which is impossible unless our souls existed somewhere before they entered this human shape. So in that way, too, it seems likely that the soul is immortal.
How did the proofs of that theory of recollection go, Kedis? At the moment, I can't quite recollect.
It went something like this. We had knowledge, both before and at the moment of birth, of all absolute standards. Our present argument applies to absolute beauty, goodness, uprightness, holiness, and all those characteristics which we designate in our discussions by the term absolute. So we must have obtained knowledge of all these characteristics before our birth.
That is right, Gebbies. And unless we invariably forget it after obtaining it, we must always be born knowing, and continue to know all through our lives. Because to know means simply to retain the knowledge which one has acquired and not to lose it. Is not what we call forgetting simply the loss of knowledge, Simmias?
Yes. Yes.
And if it is true that we acquired our knowledge before our birth, and lost it at the moment of birth, but afterwards, by the exercise of our senses upon sensible objects, recover the knowledge which we had once before, I suppose that what we call learning will be the recovery of our own knowledge. And surely we should be right in calling this recollection.
Quite so.
Well now, Simmias, if all these absolute realities, such as beauty and goodness, which we're always talking about, really exist, if it is to them, as we rediscover our own former knowledge of them, that we refer, as copies of their patterns, all the objects of our physical perception, if these realities exist, does it not follow that our souls must exist too, even before our birth? Whereas if they do not exist, our discussion would seem to be a waste of time. Is this the position, that it is logically just as certain that our souls exist before our birth as it is that these realities exist, and that if the one is impossible, so is the other?
It is perfectly obvious to me, Socrates, that the same logical necessity applies to both.
Then let us return to the same examples which we were discussing before. Does that absolute reality which we define in our discussions remain always constant and invariable or not?
It must be constant and invariable, Socrates.
Well, what about the concrete instances of beauty, such as men, horses, clothes, and so on, or any other members of a class corresponding to an absolute entity?
Well, then, Socrates, it is just the opposite. I mean, they're never free from variation.
And these concrete objects you can touch and see and perceive by your other senses, but those constant entities you cannot possibly apprehend except by thinking. They are invisible to our sight.
That is true.
So you think that we should assume two classes of things, one visible and the other invisible?
Yes.
The invisible being invariable, and the visible never being the same.
Yes, we should assume that too.
Well now, are we not part body, part soul?
Certainly.
Then to which class do we say that the body would have the closest resemblance and relation?
Quite obviously to the visible.
What do we say about the soul then? Is it visible or invisible?
It's invisible.
So, Socrates, the soul is more like the invisible, and the body more like the visible.
That's right, my dear Fido. Did we not say that when the soul uses the instrumentality of the body for any inquiry, whether through sight or hearing or any other sense, because using the body implies using the senses, it is drawn away by the body into the realm of the variable, and loses its way and becomes confused and dizzy as though it were fuddled through contact with things of a similar nature?
Certainly.
But when the soul investigates by itself, it passes into the realm of the pure and everlasting and immortal and changeless. And being of a kindred nature, when it is once independent and free from interference, consorts with it always, and strays no longer, but remains in that realm of the absolute, constant, and invariable, through contact with beings of a similar nature. And this condition of the soul we call wisdom.
Yes. That's an excellent description, and perfectly true, Socrates.
Very well, then. In the light of all that we have said, both now and before, To which class do you think that the soul bears the closer resemblance and relation?
I think, Socrates, that even the dullest person would agree from this line of reasoning that the soul is in every possible way more like the invariable than the variable.
And the body?
Well, the body is, of course, variable.
Yes. Look at it this way, too. When body and soul are both in the same place, nature teaches the one to serve and be subject, the other to rule and govern. In this relation, which do you think resembles the divine and which the mortal part? Don't you think that it is the nature of the divine to rule and direct, and that of the mortal to be subject and serve?
I do.
Then which does the soul resemble?
Obviously, Socrates, soul resembles the divine, and body the mortal.
Yes, yes.
Now, Kebis, see whether this is our conclusion from all that we've said. The soul is most like that which is divine, immortal, intelligible, uniform, indissoluble, and ever self-consistent and invariable. Whereas body is most like that which is human, mortal, multiform, unintelligible, dissoluble, and never self-consistent. Can we adduce any conflicting argument, my dear Kebis, to show that this is not so?
No, I don't think we can.
Very well, then. In that case, is it not natural for body to disintegrate rapidly, but for soul to be quite, very nearly, indissoluble?
Certainly.
And so, Kebis, those who care about their souls and do not subordinate them to the body dissociate themselves firmly from these others and refuse to accompany them on their haphazard journey. And believing that it is wrong to oppose philosophy with her offer of liberation and purification, they turn and follow her wherever she leads.
Socrates, what exactly do you mean?
I will explain. Every seeker after wisdom knows that up to the time when philosophy takes it over, his soul is a helpless prisoner, chained hand and foot in the body, compelled to view reality not directly, but only through its prison bars and wallowing in utter ignorance. And philosophy can see that the imprisonment is ingeniously affected by the prisoner's own active desire, which makes him first accessory to his own confinement. Well, philosophy takes over the soul in this condition, and by gentle persuasion tries to set it free. She points out that observation by means of the eyes and ears and all the other senses is entirely deceptive, and she urges the soul to refrain from using them unless it is necessary to do so, and encourages it to collect and concentrate itself by itself, trusting nothing but its own independent judgment, and attributing no truth to anything which it views indirectly, because such objects are tangible and visible, but what the soul itself sees is conceived only by the intellect and is invisible. But if what is immortal is also imperishable, it is impossible that at the approach of death, soul should cease to be. If soul is really immortal, surely it must be imperishable too. So it appears that when death comes to a man, the mortal part of him dies, but the immortal part retires at the approach of death and escapes, unharmed and indestructible.
Therefore, Socrates, our souls will really exist in the next world. This has the ring of truth to me.
But there is a further point, my friends. If the soul is immortal, it demands our care, not only for that part of time which we call life, but for all time. And indeed, it would seem now that it will be extremely dangerous to neglect it. If death were a release from everything, it would be a boon for the wicked, because by dying they would be released not only from the body, but also from their own wickedness, together with the soul. But as it is, since the soul is clearly immortal, it can have no escape or security from evil except by becoming as good and wise as it possibly can. For it takes nothing with it to the next world except its education and training. And these, we are told, are of supreme importance in helping or harming the newly dead at the very beginning of the journey there. But such as have purified themselves sufficiently by philosophy live thereafter altogether without bodies, which is not easy to portray, nor is there time to do so now. But the reasons which we have already described provide grounds enough, as you can see, Simmias, for leaving nothing undone to attain during life some measure of goodness and wisdom. For the prize is glorious, and the hope great. Yes. Of course, no reasonable man ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I have described them, but that either this or something very like it is a true account of our souls and their future habitation, since we have clear evidence that the soul is immortal. This, I think, is both a reasonable contention and a belief worth risking, for the risk is a noble one. We should use such accounts to inspire ourselves with confidence, and that is why I have already drawn out my tale so long. There is only one way, then, in which a man can be freed from all anxiety about the fate of his soul. If in life he has abandoned bodily pleasures and adornments as foreign to his purpose and likely to do more harm than good, and has devoted himself to the pleasures of acquiring knowledge, and so by decking his soul not with a borrowed beauty but with its own, with self-control and goodness and courage and liberality and truth, he has fitted himself to await his journey to the next world. You, Simmias and Kebis and the rest, will each of you make this journey some day in the future. But, as a character in some tragedy might say, for me the fated hour calls even now. In other words, it's about time that I took my bath. I prefer to have a bath before drinking the poison rather than give the women the trouble of washing me when I'm dead.
Very well, Socrates. But have you no directions for the others or myself about your children or anything else?
Yes.
What can we do to please you best?
Yes. Nothing new, Crito. Just what I'm always telling you. If you look after yourselves, whatever you do will please me and mine, and you too, even if you don't agree with me now. On the other hand, if you neglect yourselves and fail to follow the line of life as I have laid it down, both now and in the past, however fervently you agree with me now, it will do no good at all.
We shall try our best to do as you say. But in what fashion are we to bury you?
In any fashion you like. That is, if you can catch me and I don't slip through your fingers. I can't persuade Crito that I am this Socrates here who is talking to you now and marshalling all the arguments. He thinks that I am the one whom he will see presently lying dead. And he asks, how is he to bury me? As for my long and elaborate explanation that when I have drunk the poison I shall remain with you no longer, but depart to a state of heavenly happiness, this attempt to console both you and myself seems to have been wasted on him. You must give an assurance to Crito for me, the opposite of the one which he gave to the court which tried me. He undertook that I should stay, but you must assure him that when I am dead, I shall not stay, but depart and be gone. That will help Crito to bear it more easily, and keep him from being distressed on my account when he sees my body being burned or buried, as if something dreadful were happening to me, or from saying at the funeral that it is Socrates whom he is laying out, or carrying to the grave, or burying. Believe me, my dear friend Crito, Misstatements are not merely jarring in their immediate context, they also have a bad effect upon the soul. No, you must keep up your spirits and say that it is only my body that you are burying, and you can bury it as you please, in whatever way you think it most proper.
Oh, what a wonderful man the master was, Fido. And was that the last time you heard him speak?
With these words, he got up and went into another room to bathe. And Crito went after him, but told us to wait. So we waited, discussing and reviewing what had been said, or else dwelling upon the greatness of the calamity which had befallen us. For we felt just as though we were losing a father,
yes,
and should be orphans for the rest of our lives.
Yes.
Meanwhile, when Socrates had taken his bath, his children were brought to see him. He had 2 little sons and 1 big boy, and the women of his household, arrived. He talked to them in Crito's presence and gave them directions about carrying out his wishes. Then he told the women and children to go away and came back himself to join us. It was now nearly sunset, because he had spent a long time inside. He came and sat down, fresh from the bath, and he'd only been talking for a few minutes when the prison officer came in.
Socrates?
Yes, my dear fellow.
Socrates, I can't reproach you as I reproach others for being angry with me and cursing whenever by order of the rulers I direct them to drink the poison. In your time here, I've known you for the most generous and gentlest and best of men who've ever come to this place. And now especially I feel it isn't with me that you're angry, but with others, because you know who are responsible. Well, now, you know the message I've come to bring. Goodbye then. Try to bear what must be as easily as you can.
Goodbye to you, too. We will do as you say. Ah, what a pleasant fellow. All the time I've been here, he has visited me and sometimes had discussions with me, shown me the greatest kindness. And how generous of him now to shed tears for me at parting. But come, Crito, let us do as he says. Someone had better bring in the poison if it is ready prepared. If not, tell the man to prepare it.
Oh, but surely, Socrates, the sun's still upon the mountains. It's not gone down yet. Besides, I know that in other cases people have dinner and enjoy their wine and sometimes the company of those whom they love, long after they receive the warning, and only drink the poison quite late at night. But now there's no need to hurry. There's still plenty of time.
It is natural that these people whom you speak of should act in this way, Crito, because they think that they gain by it. And it is also natural that I should not, because I believe that I should gain nothing by waiting just a little longer. I should only make myself ridiculous in my own eyes if I clung to life when it has nothing more to offer. Come, do as I say, and don't make difficulties.
At this, Crito made a sign to his servant who was standing nearby. The servant went out and, after spending a considerable time, returned with the man who was to administer the poison. He was carrying it ready prepared in a cup.
Well, my good fellow, you understand these things. What ought I to do?
Just drink it, then walk about until you feel a weight in your legs. Then lie down. Then it'll act of its own accord.
As he spoke, he handed the cup to Socrates, who received it quite cheerfully, without a tremor, without any change of color or expression, and said, looking up under his brows with his usual steady gaze,
"What do you say about pouring a libation from this drink? Is it permitted or not?"
Oh, we only prepare what we regard as the normal dose, Socrates.
I see. But I suppose I am allowed, or rather bound, to pray the gods that my removal from this world to the other may be prosperous. This is my prayer, then, and I hope that it may be granted.
With these words, quite calmly and with no sign of distaste, he drained the cup in one breath. Up to this time, most of us have been fairly successful in keeping back our tears, but when we saw that he was drinking, that he had actually drunk it, we could do so no longer. In spite of myself, the tears came pouring out, so that I covered my face and wept broken-heartedly, not for him, but for my own calamity in losing such a friend. Crito had given up even before me and turned away when he could not restrain his tears. But Apollodorus, who had never stopped crying even before, now broke out into such a storm of passionate weeping that he made everyone in the room break down, except Socrates himself.
Oh, really, my friends, what a way to behave. Why, that was my main reason for sending the women away to prevent this sort of disturbance. One should make one's end in a tranquil frame of mind. Calm yourselves and try to be brave.
This made us feel ashamed, and we controlled our tears. Socrates walked about, and presently, saying that his legs were heavy, lay down on his back. That was what the man recommended. The man, he was the same one who had administered the poison, kept his hand upon Socrates, and after a little while examined his feet and legs, then pinched his foot hard and asked if he felt it. Socrates said, no. Then he did the same to his legs, and moving gradually upwards in this way, let us see that he was getting cold and numb. Presently he felt him again, and said that when it reached the heart, Socrates would be gone. The coldness was spreading about as far as his waist when Socrates uncovered his face, for he had covered it up, and said,
Crito, we ought to offer a cockerel to Asclepius. See to it. And don't forget.
No, it can't be done. Are you sure that there is nothing else?
Socrates made no reply to this question. But after a little while he stirred, and when the man uncovered him, his eyes were fixed. When Crito saw this, he closed the mouth and eyes. Such, Socrates, was the end of our comrade, who was, we may fairly say, of all those whom we knew in our time, the bravest, and also the wisest and most upright man.
Days of Socrates by Plato was edited for radio by David Rees from the translation by Hugh Tredennick. Socrates was Leo McKern. Crito was played by Cyril Luckham, Phaedo by John Rye, Echecrates by Christopher Douglas, Simmias by William Hope, Kebes by Peter Aker. The prison officer was played by David Sinclair. The music was composed and conducted by Christos Pitas. The Last Days of Socrates was directed by John Theocharis.